What we are seeing is bodies that are anxious, bodies that are not very securely attached, bodies that are the subject of the most intense commercial preoccupation coming from the outside, bodies which are always searching for solutions. They're not actually bodies that we can afford to live from. I used to call this the democratization of beauty, but I actually think it's the democratization of hated bodies. It may be very hard to be body positive. It may be that a more modest claim to dare to be okay in your body is more manageable. If I were to be designing an NHS that was actually interested in people's health, I would be starting at the beginning, and I would be starting with what kind of pregnancy services would we be having. We can't actually do a health service at the level that we're doing it. It's just not practical. Are we looking at Sudan and South Sudan? Are we looking at Gaza? Are we looking at what still goes on in Syria? Are we looking at the kind of violence that we had in England, wanting to burn down people who are trying to make life here? The assault on the other. We don't have any situation in which we're allowed to think about the humanity of the people. We're just thinking about the humanity of one side.
Welcome to Medicine Unheard. My name is Hamad, and this is where healthcare workers change conversations around health and care. In today's episode, we're joined by Susie Orbach, described as Britain's most prominent psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, and writer known for her works on body image, feminism, and the intersections between psychology and culture. In this discussion, we talk about how the body has become a site and substrate in which health occurs, health is displayed, and health is manufactured in perhaps unhealthy ways. And in the era of Ozempic, how the body is further subjected to wider or thinner cultural expectations. This entire discussion can be summed down to the simple fact that our bodies are under attack by societal and cultural influences, but also recently, directly through egregious military violence. There's a lot to get into. But first, let's start with Susie's background.
I've been a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst for a long time. And many years ago, I wrote a book called Fat is a Feminist Issue, which was trying to look at the whole idea of what fat means in our culture and what it means specifically for women. Not the actual adiposity of it, but the fact that people are preoccupied by it and preoccupied by thin, and what that has to do with women's social role, etc. I kind of thought I had everything that I wanted to say there, but I seem to have written another 4 books about bodies. And partly that's happened because the attack on bodies is now so severe and so intense that it's really eating into the childhoods of our kids and into the old age of my friends. It's gone global. And I wanted to try and understand what was happening. And in my practice, which is it's a normal psychotherapeutic practice, it isn't focused on bodies or eating problems. But what I noticed in the last, say, 15 years was that people would come in, and when they were talking about themselves, they would routinely say, and I have this kind of, obviously I do this and do that with my body, and I do this, and I can't eat this, and I don't allow myself that. And they all had body preoccupations which they felt that they would need to live with for the rest of their lives. And I thought this is a new development where we've accepted a notion of troubled bodies, insecure bodies, bodies being under assault as something we just have to live with. And that was the origin of writing Bodies.
Speaking on the concept and the role of therapy, you once said that the therapist has to do some kind of magic, which is he or she has to surrender themselves in the therapy room and enter into the hurt, heart, the body, the longings, the desires, the conflicts of the other, and feel them in a version of how they feel them. And then they have to divide themselves simultaneously so they can reflect and think, what is the problem I'm being presented with? And how might I be of help to the person in front of me? Reading that quote, I draw perhaps an obtuse and general similarity in comparison to the work and ideal of a doctor, or really just generally a healthcare worker, to make sense of the suffering that the person in front of me is presenting with, being in my particular field a clinical conduit, trying to ameliorate through sort of paradigms of scientific understanding. But you were obviously speaking from a background as a psychotherapist. I wonder if you can give a sort of introduction. What is psychotherapy? And you say you saw a lot of body preoccupations in your time, a lot of the time as a psychotherapist with your patients.
What does a psychotherapist do? Psychotherapist is interested in meeting the person where they are, understanding how they describe what ails them. And as we listen to the person, we are observing them. We're observing whether their conversation is halting, whether it's direct, whether it's repetitive, what the emotional timbre of the conversation is, whether it's repetitive in terms of how they keep saying it or don't keep saying it, where the pauses are. And we're also concerned, as that quote remarked, on the impact of the person on us. And what the psychotherapist tries to do, well, the setup, if you like, is like a lab. It's a lab for understanding for both parties. So the person who's speaking, let's call them the patient hears themselves speak, hears the catches in their voice, hears what they can't say, hears their hesitations, hears their certainties and thinks, no, I don't really feel so certain about that, backtracks on themselves. But they also are inviting you to engage with them at the level of, can we open that conversation up? Can we, what I've written before, can we turn a full stop into a comma? Can we extend a thought? Can we get curious about what your understanding is of yourself or the others or the situation that you're in? So that's the general idea of what a psychotherapist does, with the idea that the kinds of questioning or engagement that the psychotherapist has with the patient becomes internalized for the person, and they begin to be able to be curious and questioning of themselves and to expand their emotional and repertoire. So they begin to understand that a feeling may be much more complex than it looks in the first instance, like feeling of anger might turn out to be dismay or disappointment or despair. It's got a lot more color in it, or a word might have a lot more. There isn't just one word for an idea. And that they're in a journey of self-reflection with somebody who's really interested in them. I think that's the best way I can say it. And it's a very active kind of thing, therapy. It isn't passive, even though it happens quietly in a room together.
That's brilliant. And as you say, you've noticed perhaps deep-seated, coiled preoccupations of your patients. I think perhaps culturally too, we'll get onto that, about anxieties around our bodies. You write in the book, bodies are made. They are no longer seen or experienced simply as things to be washed, deodorized, dressed and perfumed before getting on with our day. Bodies now are ever malleable, calling cards, either erasing or articulating our class, geographic and ethnic backgrounds, and gender aspirations. I just wonder if you can touch on that and the sort of interface that our body is now playing, typically played historically, but now more so in a way in which you would say infringes upon our sort of liberties, but also, like you say, it constructs visceral aspects of our identities, or rather we relate it viscerally to aspects of our identities.
Well, we're introduced to our notion of how our body should be. I think the argument is there is no such thing as a body. There is only a body that is the outcome of the bodies that they've grown up with, which are situated in a culture, whether one is conscious of that or not, that is situated within a gender, that is situated with sets of longings, prescriptions, proscriptions, and limits, as well as longings. So there's both the conscious idea of when you have a baby, what that baby is going to be, but there's also the baby of the parenting people that is brought to the baby, which embodies itself or encodes a set of ideas about bodies. And at this moment in history, whether we're in the West or we're in Japan, Singapore, or urban cities in South America or North America or Europe, I think what we are seeing is bodies that are anxious, bodies that are not very securely attached, bodies that are continually reflecting on themselves, being watchful, bodies that are the subject of the most intense commercial preoccupation coming from the outside, and that the bodies that we then come to inhabit are bodies which are always searching for solutions. They're not actually bodies that we can afford to live from. So if I look at youngsters now, three-year-olds already playing for camera, they already know that the body is something to be displayed, to be performed. And by the time they're 6 or 7, they may be mucking about with either their food or their fingernails or their hair, not just to decorate, but to somehow make a body that is reflective of the body they think they're supposed to be in. And I used to call this the democratization of beauty, but I actually think it's the democratization of hated bodies, is that now what we've done is not just exported troubled bodies all over the world, but we've got very troubled bodies at home. That what is in very early relationships is so much anxiety about how I'm going to look after, how this body is going to be, how I'm feeding this baby, that it gets straight into the relationship and forms that core relationship that the individual has towards their own body.
I think touching on that, and there's sort of anxiety that you talk about, it starts from childhood. There's also the idea of anti-aging, annihilating aging too. You write in the book, we are not allowed to age. It is considered a disgrace, not a sign of knowledge, wisdom, and then decline. And we also write further, aging and dying are now being reconceived as infirmities and potentially unnecessary. And it's obviously true in the way which we're seeing, whether it's procedures, like you say, jawbones being shaven, tummy tucked, sculpting the contours of our body so that it can display a perpetual sort of artifice of perpetual youth. Why is that? Where is this cultural attitude coming from? And then what are the sort of precipitations of that?
Well, there are a lot of commercial players in the field. We have visual cultures. We used to have very simple iconography, but now the body has come in to stand for all of our icons. So you could be in China and see westernized bodies on billboards so huge you've never seen anything as big, displaying what the ideal body is. And you could have, well, you do have that. So let's just say that. So where does it come from? Think of the industries, look at the European industries, the most successful, the people rebuilding Notre Dame in Paris. Where's that money come from? You might think high tech, but no, it's come from the beauty industry, the fashion industry. Then there's the pharmaceutical industries, which are making a fortune, making people feel that they can fix their bodies. Whether they felt that they were trying to undermine them in the first place is another question. Then there's the food and the diet industries, which obviously make more money if they create many different kinds of foods, and particularly non-food foods, which don't satisfy, which don't get metabolized, as well as create all these different low-fat, treat foods. I can't list them all. They're just so extensive. I see Zoe's now in that market as well. Zoe, who's claiming to be very progressive, is also in that same market. And no surprise, because they are a pharma company as well. So I think what we're seeing is industries. We think of cosmetic surgery as being a very big industry. It's very small compared to the beauty industry in general, and compared to the fashion industry, compared to the food and diet industry. But there's also, we're seeing a tremendous growth in start early, start filling your body. So these are industries that are looking for growth markets. And how do you grow them? You grow them by sending a wider group of people coming into them, older, younger, and more genders. It's the feminizing of certain kinds of faces for trans people is also part of this. There are a number of surgeries and cosmetic procedures that are offered. And if you look at the growth rates of these things, they're off the charts, really, and they're going to more and more countries. So why is it happening? I think the commercial works on the psychological and social, which then gets reinforced because people want a solution to their distress. It's a very closed little circle of longing to have a safe body and not really having it, and thinking that you need to spend more or do more or practice more or deny more in order to get there, but you don't quite feel safe. And it's very interesting because being so much older now, watching this, I don't think I know anybody in my social circle who doesn't feel we're still not supposed to look our age, even though we're really quite old at this point. And we're still supposed to be putting on the mascara or whatever the hell it is in a way that is about signaling that we're still part of the game. And I think what's so bizarre is that at this moment of digitization or AI, where our bodies are becoming dematerialized, we're attempting to rematerialize them or hypermaterialize them, but in ways that make them look kind of digital and all the same. So it's a really interesting cultural paradox at the moment, I think.
It's one that most interests me in particular because, as you say, the human form is no longer born but manufactured. You have this cultural impetus with commercial interests. And then you have this idea of the transhuman, debiologized humanoid designed to surpass limits of organic bodies, perhaps simply just an extension of our currently predominant desire to recreate better bodily images for others. And as you say, a rapidly dematerialized silicone-saturated body made for display. It seems quite perverse, particularly this concept of digitalizing ourselves into becoming the better human. The idea that the ultimate endpoint of biological perfection, if there is such a thing, is actually in rejecting its natural trajectory entirely, denying organismal cell death and annihilating aging together, to become something so inorganic, so inhuman, that through the departure of our biological bodies, we actually somehow become something augmented and more human.
I think what's so interesting about that is that, of course, we have human desires to soar. We have human desires to transform. We have longings. But once they become totally dematerialized and they get like, oh, if only I could fly. I mean, the whole point about If Only I Could Fly is it allows you to think in different kinds of ways. It allows you to create cultural practices for all of us. Whereas this is it's a bit, what can I say? It's very disturbing.
It's the mantra of biology limits us, technology will liberate us. But as you say, I think at one point in another talk, you also said that equally these sort of precision instruments are cultural contexts of their own biases and racial contexts that they come in, whether you're designing these algorithms, they're not going to be without human error and imperfections too. There's challenges in that realm. I just want to touch back on the concepts of body anxiety, the concepts of commercial interest in the body. What is your opinion and perspective on the post-Me Too era with body positivity? Has it sort of won anything over? Is it useful? What are your perceptions on that?
Well, I think anything that's claiming to be progressive is worth looking at. The question, I suppose, about body positivity is, it may be very hard to be body positive. It may be that a more modest claim to dare to be okay in your body is more manageable. Because I look at people of all different sizes and I think it's wonderful now that particularly women don't have shame or obvious shame about dressing as they wish. On the other hand, I'm also aware that it's not quite so simple, that there's a lot of drinking which goes along with it. And I think, well, is that actually concealing the difficulty because the culture hasn't done it? But I'm very happy that we have a body positivity movement. I just think if it had smaller aims, it might be better. Because I think daring to live in your body is quite a radical idea.
Moving on to what has made headlines recently in the past week here, at least, the government suggesting that injections of semaglutide, Wegovy, Ozempic could be used to reduce worklessness in the UK. There's something quite macabre and dystopian, I might have to say, latent in this line of thinking and a policy shift. Firstly, that will start injecting the unemployed with drugs to suppress their appetite and make them harder. But secondly, the idea that health and well-being matters in an economic capitalist context. Can you generate growth and productivity? Can you become a fiscal multiplier if we absolve you from your burden to obesity? And if yes, then you can have this treatment. What is your conceptualization around this? Because you write actually in the book, our current emphasis on skinniness is an outcome of the riches of the West, which has taken itself, making us feel as if we have to exhibit amongst all this abundance its opposite, that we are free of need, can be highly selective, and are able to control the food we require and can do away with the materiality of the body. In the era of Ozempic, what's your understanding of it all?
Well, I have been scratching my head for the last week and thinking, what on earth is West Streeting on? I mean, hasn't the body had enough attacks? And where has this got to do with unemployment? I mean, if you were reforming the job centres and there actually were jobs there where people were contributing and not having to display themselves, making a contribution to society, people would feel a whole lot better. So I think it's an appalling policy, and it doesn't mean that people don't hurt from obesity. And I don't even like the word obesity, but given the ingestion of non-food foods and the way that shuts down your metabolism and the difficulties that people can have, of course there are going to be people for whom these drugs can be very, very useful. But I think if I were to be designing an NHS that was actually interested in people's health, I would be starting at the beginning, and I would be starting with what kind of pregnancy services would we be having? What kind of support would we be giving to expectant parents? Because everybody wants to do right when they're pregnant, when they're bringing life into the world. What kind of support system do we have? Now, I mean, the difference between when I had a baby and what's going on now is that there's all these tests all the time, which are being done, both to reassure, but also to check out the insurance situation so that something doesn't happen, rather than the midwife or the health visitor being somebody who's there to listen and to support and to bring mums together or potential parents together to talk through, for example, their anxieties about their bodies, to challenge the idea that you have to get into your genes the week after you've had a baby, to actually talk about what the early bonding and attachment relationship is, to discourage women from feeling that there's something awful about having lines on their head so they don't have to have Botox, because that interferes with the baby's perception of emotional life. So I would be starting at the beginning and thinking, and this is not an original thought, we know that this is something that many, many people think, is that we should be starting at the beginning, putting many resources into the supporting of new life and the supporting of life after birth and to parents, and then preparing, if we're looking in the area of the body, preparing nursery schools for how to help children recognize their appetites for food, recognize their appetites for sleep, instead of just having them rigidified or having a ban on cakes, for example, which I know some nursery schools do, which is somehow brings into the idea that cakes are somehow poison, rather than that cakes are for celebrating a birthday. And then I would go to the school teachers and look at their own relationship to their bodies and what they're conveying to the children when they're talking about nutrition and health, and because I think it's often inflected with difficulty. And in the secondary, I know this doesn't sound like the NHS, but it's a piece of it. I would be looking at really what is the body, what constitutes health, what are the things that we do that enhance, and what are the things that we do that hurt. And I would take many of the curriculums and I'd look at the chemistry curriculum and I'd show kids how you make makeup and what goes in it and how it pollutes the world. Or I'd look at the economics curriculum and look at what creates pollution in the world. Is it the transport of clothes that are going to be to the third world whose own clothing industries are being destroyed by the stuff that's coming in from places where we're already ruining their water systems. I mean, I would take a curriculum where you do your maths, your economics, your chemistry, your biology, all through the mechanism of the body to show how the body is subject to life, but is also subject to terrible constriction and what that means. I don't know if I'm giving you a sense, but I suppose Wegovy or, these new drugs, yeah, I'm sure they have a place, but I think it's very interesting that every day there's another article. Yesterday's New York Times was about how, this deals with addiction of all kinds. Now, it's very interesting if a diabetic drug has the effect of feeling that people can slow down and reflect that they don't want any more food or they don't want another shot. That would be really interesting. But that is all in the delivery of the drug, as opposed to what we're going to do is give everybody drugs and solve the unemployment policy.
I was going to mention, you conceptualizing what the role of the health service is in actually creating health and enhancing health. We're sort of entering this era of prevention. Prevention is the sort of word of the hour, saturated in health policy contexts. And I think it's creating a new sort of social contract of health too, that self-care is healthcare, despite the fact that there's commercial deterrents of health, despite the fact that there's political deterrents of health, that we're empowering patients by giving them the opportunities. And what are the opportunities? Apparently they're packaged with doses and saying that this is the opportunity for a better life. And as you say, there's this ever increasing pile of pharmaceuticals. I sort of call it the paradox of modern medicine too, that we live at the age of modern medicine, the greatest height of scientific understanding, and yet we're also experiencing a great unprecedented burden of disease, whether that's created or whether that's actually real. But this constant need to pathologize and then ameliorate. And that is where prevention is. But you say no, prevention is starting from changing the hearts and minds within communities at sites where they're learning through their education at school.
Yeah, because we can't actually do a health service at the level that we're doing it. It's just not practical. And I do think we need human agency, but I think we've got to be very careful when we're talking about partnership, because if you don't educate people for partnership, which we should do, then how do you choose between some crap thing on TikTok or Instagram or real health benefits? I mean, I think we can all accept that exercise is useful. We can also accept that eating real food is really a good idea. We can also accept that having feelings and being able to digest them. We can also accept that having community and friendship is critical. What beyond that do we accept as constituting the most primary conditions for an okay life? I mean, I'm not sure we are, we know we shouldn't be polluting our rivers. We shouldn't be polluting our earth. I mean, we could go on in the list of what's terrible, and we're always playing catch up because most cancers are still environmental. They aren't coming because we're not doing the right thing. Some of them are, of course, but I still think we haven't quite got the emphasis right, really. And it's a difficult thing. And I'm a psychotherapist. I'm not even a doctor or an economist. And I think we need really substantial conversations about what actually constitutes health. What government policies constitute public health? How do we do things so that we don't do harm, but we actually increase the capacity of citizens, of all of us, to both contribute, but also understand ourselves and our communities better?
And on that, do you feel that we will ever be liberated? What is the utopia, and in the most positive sense, that we can reach towards body acceptance, true body positivity, living with the idea of understanding that we don't need to be sort of entangled in this deficit model of health, well-being, and occupying a body that is...
Well, I think in relation to the body acceptance, that's one thing, right? It would be great if kids really grew up and knew what the hell their bodies were for. The fact that their hands can grab things or play instruments and their legs can let them run and their bodies are really, I suppose I'm talking a pre sort of 60s idea of what the body did. It's in and of itself excellent. It is in and of itself a really wonderful place to live from. And that the thing that's really exciting about life is that bodies change and they're not static in any sense. So that your body at 8 or 9 is going to be really different than at 11 and at 14 and at 18 and at 22. And how you relate to it will depend on how you interact with other bodies. And if other bodies can feel confident, I think it's very interesting being old, actually. I thought it would be really a nightmare. It is interesting. Bodies go through, they go through developmental phases, and sometimes they're excruciating. But what would be lovely is if we could go through those stages without the overlay of the deficit model the whole time. As if what we could do is be really interested and intrigued instead of periods being a terrible thing. They're a very exciting moment. I kind of want to relish those things.
I think when we're talking about bodies and we're talking about sites of anxiety and whatever else, I think it would be amiss to not mention, as you say, a form of violence. You write it in the book too, but in a more feminist lens, that if we then think about the more recognized forms of violence, such as rape as a weapon of war, sexual violence, sexual harassment, the theft of women's sexual pleasure and reproductive rights through female genital mutilation, and so on, we see that women are vulnerable in what ought to be the most taken for granted place of safety, their bodies. And I think for the past year, and even more so, in sites of conflicts, we see an incredible amount of egregious bodily violence too. And there's this fear of becoming so sensitized to that, and it becoming ambient as well. And I wonder what your sort of reaction is to the feed that we're seeing, and whether you can relate from your sort of past experiences, what are the repercussions of, what we're seeing, the bodies that are under incredible duress too. And this whole idea, this militarization complex that we're, some particular factions of the population are living under, and the effects of that.
I don't know how to really respond, because we shouldn't be seeing this, because it shouldn't be happening, and we are seeing. Are we looking at Sudan and South Sudan? Are we looking at Gaza? Are we looking at what still goes on in Syria? Are we looking at kind of violence that we had in England a few weeks ago, or a month or two ago, with wanting to burn down people who are trying to make life here? The assault on the other and the aggressivity of the military world. I mean, all I know is that none of these forms of war would be happening at this kind of level if we didn't have huge industries running on that as well. I mean, that's going to be my mantra today, isn't it? Is that in this case, we've got armaments, and we've got governments corruptly selling and arms fairs, and that being considered perfectly okay. But actually, we don't have any situation in which we're allowed to think about the humanity of the people. We're just thinking about the humanity of one side, and that cannot be right.
It's just interesting to me, because a lot of these ideologies permeate through the concept of bodies. What is the other, and what are their bodies, and what does that signal, and how do we dehumanize them? How do others dehumanize them? It all relates back to what you say, which is that our bodies display to, whether it's pernicious, pervasive, perverted ideas of class, ethnicity, humanity, inhumanity. So just quite incredible. And I just, perhaps at the close of this conversation, I want to touch on your primary message to the future health workforce, healthcare workers, that you would want, the message that you want them to take away from reading this book, Bodies, and understanding what you want them to understand.
Well, I have no idea what I want. I mean, I wish I could say that succinctly, is that we are physical, corporeal, meaning-making species. That is what we are. We need each other desperately. And the more we can engage and recognize our similarities and our differences without that being contentious, is a way that we can cooperate wherever we find ourselves, that everybody is unique, but that uniqueness also is because we're part of a species that has the capacity to be unique. I think as a psychotherapist, I spend my days listening. I think it's very hard with the strictures of the health service for people to listen. It's simply not their fault. And they need support. All health practitioners need support in listening and being able to tolerate what they're hearing, and then have some reflective time to think about with their patient or their group of patients what they're supposed to do with that information that they have. Because there's lots of exciting things that are being developed, but if you haven't heard properly in the first place, they're not much use.
I think just quickly to tack on to that as well, I really appreciate the value of listening. As you say, we have an industrialized model of healthcare and the health service where the BMJ reported a study this summer that the median time a doctor takes to listen to their patient before interrupting them is 11 seconds. And as you say, that's partly due to the design and mechanisms, the atomization of the patient experience too. But how do you think it's helped in your experience?
I don't think you can get a grip in 11 seconds. I mean, first of all, you've got somebody who's nervous coming to talk to you. The patient projects so much longing onto a doctor that they will be understood. So 11 seconds doesn't give you much chance to be understood. And it doesn't give the doctor enough chance to see how that person is behaving. So the value of listening is for the doctor to reflect as well as for the patient to be able to articulate what they need to say. And it's bad enough with a 10-minute appointment, but 11 seconds as an interruption, that's really tough. I do know that doctors who listen, I'm lucky I have a wonderful practice. You know, they always give you time and they're very efficient. But I don't think that's true for a lot of the practices around. I think they're squeezed and they don't all have the right principles.